Welcome to the deep dive. You send us what you're reading, and we pull out the crucial insights. No fluff, just the stuff that gets you thinking.
And today we're diving into Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy.
Right. It's a really powerful look, maybe a bit unsettling too, at how democracy seems to be, well, shifting, changing shape across the world.
Absolutely. And Applebaum kicks things off with something very personal, doesn't she? This memory of a New Year's Eve party.
Yeah, at her place in rural Poland, way back in 1999.
Poland was, on the cusp of big changes then. There was this real sense of optimism.
Totally. She paints this picture, right? A farmhouse, maybe 100 people, dodgy fireworks. You can feel that post-Soviet hope.
But then she makes this really striking point. Fast forward about 20 years.
And basically half the people at that party wouldn't even talk to the other half anymore.
Not because of personal stuff, but politics.
Exactly. Deep political divides, specifically across the sort of right-wing spectrum in places like Poland, Hungary, Spain, France, Italy, the UK, even the US.
It really shows how deep these fractures have become.
It really does, and the personal cost.
Well, yeah. Applebaum felt it directly. Once law and justice took power in Poland, she became a target.
Because she writes critically for international media.
Precisely. So pro-government media started accusing her of, being part of some secret network-coordinated negative press, even making stuff up about her family.
Wow. That really highlights the kind of tactics that get used.
It does. It shows how dissent gets silenced.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. What we're really trying to get to grips with today using her book are those core questions she raises.
Like, what are the actual ways democracies can erode? How do they slide towards something more authoritarian?
And what's the role of intellectuals, the elites in all this? Are they propping up democracy or helping to tear it down?
And what about the appeal? Why do people find authoritarianism attractive? What are the sort of emotional pulls, the societal factors?
Right. Why do democratic norms start to feel less important, maybe?
Yeah.
And finally, what specific examples does she give from different countries?
Okay, where should we start? Maybe with the intellectuals, the clerks.
Yeah, let's start there. Julian Benda's idea, right? Le Trésison des clercs.
Exactly. His book from 1927, he saw intellectuals abandoning the search for truth, for reason.
And getting swept up in political passions instead, left or right.
Both, yeah. He wasn't just worried about the leaders, but the thinkers, the writers, the ones who provide the intellectual cover, the justification for authoritarianism.
And Applebaum argues this isn't just history, it's happening now.
Right. She says that for liberal democracy to fall, it needs more than just strongmen. It needs a new elite, new clerks.
People who actively undermine the current values.
From
Provoke something else.
Exactly. People who imagine and sell a different, less democratic system.
Does she give examples of who these modern clerks might be?
She does. She points to maybe far-left campus activists trying to shut down debate, or the people behind online pylons, Twitter mobs.
Trying to silence people for breaking unwritten rules.
Yeah. And she even mentioned spin doctors in the British Labour Party, arguing they suppressed criticism of Corbyn, despite, concerns about anti-Semitism and his agenda.
And she makes a really key distinction here, doesn't she? Authoritarianism isn't strictly left or right.
No, it's more like an anti-pluralist mindset, a dislike of complexity of debate.
So disagreement isn't seen as healthy, it's seen as a threat.
Exactly. A threat to the one correct way of thinking. And that mindset really feeds the appeal of the one-party state.
Okay, let's unpack that. How does the one-party state idea work here?
Well, unlike democracy, which ideally involves competition and, merit, the illiberal one-party state defines the elite political, cultural, financial based on loyalty.
Loyalty to the party, not necessarily ability.
Primarily loyalty. It's about allegiance, not open competition or proven skill.
Right, so it's who you know, who you're loyal to, not what you know.
Pretty much. And Applebaum notes how some of her former friends in Poland actually came to believe that a one-party state led by what they called better sorts of Poles.
People loyal to the leader, Kaczyński.
Yeah. They thought that was actually fairer than messy, competitive democracy. She even quotes Kaczyński using that exact phrase, a better sort of Pole.
That's a fundamental rejection of democratic competition, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is how this often goes hand in hand with a very selective view of the past.
You mean the anti-communism thing in Poland and Hungary?
Exactly. Strong anti-communist rhetoric, but then, as Applebaum points out, you find former communists in pretty high places in those same governments.
Like Stanisław Piotrowicz in Poland. ex-communist prosecutor, then nominated to their constitutional court by Law and Justice.
Him, yes. And Orban employing former communists in Hungary, too.
So what's the explanation for that contradiction?
Applebaum suggests it might link back to resentment. People who felt they deserved more success after communism fell but didn't get it. Maybe they felt overlooked by the new meritocratic system.
So the target shifts from communism to anyone not aligned with the current party?
It seems that way. And this kind of environment, this resentment, it sets the stage perfectly for what she calls medium-sized lies.
Okay, medium-sized lies. That's a really interesting concept. How is it different from, say, the big lie?
Well, the big lies of the 20th century were these huge, all-encompassing falsehoods. Think totalitarian propaganda.
Right.
The medium-sized lie is different. It doesn't always completely contradict everyday experience. It offers an alternative version of reality.
And constructed carefully
Right.
using modern methods.
Yeah, often using modern marketing, social media. It's crafted.
The prime example she uses for Poland is the Smolensk conspiracy theory, right?
Definitely. The belief that the 2010 plane crash that killed President Lech Kaczynski wasn't an accident but some kind of plot.
Applebaum knew people on that plane, didn't she?
She did, which makes her perspective really personal. She shows how that lie became central to Polish politics, used by Jarosław Kaczyński to energize his base, create distrust.
And how was it institutionalized? Because it wasn't just talk, was it?
No. Antoni Macierewicz, who'd pushed these theories for years, was made defense minister, despite promises otherwise.
And he set up a new investigation.
A new commission, yeah, filled it with people who weren't experts in air crashes, dismissed the official report, and apparently police even intimidated the original aviation experts.
So a politically useful narrative becomes official policy regardless of facts.
Exactly. And the Smolensk lie, as Applebaum sees it, did two things. It morally justified other government actions.
And it helped define that new elite, the better sorts. Belief in the conspiracy became a badge of loyalty.
Precisely. It became a substitute for actual merit or competence. If you believed the lie, you were a true patriot.
And we see similar patterns in Hungary.
Yeah, with their own medium-sized lies. Constant propaganda blaming problems, economic issues, the pandemic on, non-existent Muslim migrants, the EU, George Soros.
Always Soros.
Always Soros. And she highlights Maria Schmidt, a historian, once an anti-communist dissident.
But now she promotes these narratives.
Actively. Despite benefiting from the post-communist transition herself, her son even went to Soros's university.
The irony.
It's quite something. Applebaum describes Schmidt taking over a magazine, using tactics reminiscent of the old Communist Party replacing independent journalists with loyalists.
And that mercenaries of Soros list.
Yeah, that was particularly nasty. Equating NGOs with ISIS, putting the leader of the Hungarian Jewish community on the cover with banknotes. Just blatant demonization.
Chilling stuff. This seems to connect to another idea she explores. Nostalgia. But a specific kind.
Right. She uses Svetlana Boyn's distinction. There's reflective nostalgia, kind of wistful longing.
And then there's restorative nostalgia.
Exactly. That's more active. It's a desire to, quote, rebuild the lost home, to recreate a mythic past.
And the key thing is, people caught up in restorative nostalgia often believe their idealized version is the truth.
Absolutely. They dislike nuance, complexity, anything that challenges the simple, heroic story of the past. They want the myth.
And that links back to the medium-sized lies and conspiracy theories. They explain why the Golden Age was lost, blame immigrants, elites, the EU.
Precisely. It provides scapegoats. And Applebaum connects this to Fritz Stern's concept of cultural despair.
From 19th century Germany.
Yeah. His example was Julius Langbane's book, Rembrandt as Educator. It was basically a rant against modernity, science, democracy, cities, and a longing for a supposedly purer, better time. Langbehn disliked Jews as symbols of rootlessness.
So, a historical parallel for feeling like the present is degraded compared to some imagined past.
Exactly. And Applebaum sees echoes of this cultural despair today.
Like in the UK, she mentions James Delingpole.
Yeah, his nostalgia for a lost England, his blaming of the 1960s generation, and then how Europe became this symbol for many nostalgic conservatives in the UK.
The thing that supposedly ruined everything, leading to Brexit.
Right. She even talks about her friendship with Simon Heffer breaking down over the EU issue. It became that divisive.
And Dominic Cummings, he fits in here too, even with his different style.
Applebaum argues yes. Maybe not nostalgic for a specific era, but sharing that deep conviction that something essential about England was broken, dead even. He had such scorn for British institutions.
Even calling the Leave campaign stuff Soviet propaganda.
Right. And the campaign itself was full of those medium-sized lies.
Yeah.
The $350 million for the NHS, Turkey joining the EU, Farage's refugee poster.
Okay, so we have the role of intellectuals, the appeal of the one-party state, these powerful lies, the pull of nostalgia. What else contributes to this shift?
A huge factor is the fragmentation of the public sphere.
The impact of the internet, social media.
Exactly. It's completely changed how we get information.
Yeah.
Traditional media gatekeepers have lost influence.
So we don't have that single national conversation anymore. We're in separate bubbles.
Pretty much. People end up living in different information realities with different sets of facts.
Which makes it incredibly hard to even agree on basic reality, let alone tell truth from conspiracy.
And that erodes trust. Trust in media, trust in experts, trust in institutions generally.
Like courts, police, civil servants. Applebaum notes they came under attack in Poland, the UK, the US.
Yeah, their neutrality gets questioned constantly. In this kind of hyper-partisan world, just being neutral becomes suspect.
And the online world itself. She talks about the culture it fosters.
Yeah, the irony, the parody, the cynicism. It can lead to treating politics like a joke, elections as just a way to show contempt for the whole system.
That constant anger and noise can be really unnerving for people who prefer, unity and calm.
Which can create a desire to just silence the other side, shut down the noise.
And this new information world gives the modern clerks powerful tools, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They don't need street movements in the same way. They can use targeted ads, online groups, tailored historical narratives to reach people directly.
Let's look at Spain. Applebaum connects the rise of Vox to the Catalan situation.
Yes, the Catalan independence movement really shook Spain's constitutional setup. Vox jumped into that gap with a strong anti-separatist nationalist message.
And they were very savvy with social media.
Yeah. Very. YouTube, Twitter, WhatsApp. They use it all to build a sense of a unified movement, even when it was quite small initially. Think of Abascal's hashtag España Viva, hashtag the Beers for Spain events.
Creating a feeling of belonging, offering an identity based on unity, tradition.
Exactly. Appealing to people bothered by the perceived chaos of modern politics.
And Rafael Bardaghi is a key figure here. Former establishment guy embracing Trumpian tactics.
Right. Ex-advisor to the center-right party, coins Make Spain Great Again, connects with Steve Bannon, shows those international links.
And tapping into Spanish history, the Reconquista imagery.
Deliberately, Abascal riding a horse like the knights fighting the Moors. It resonates deeply there, that idea of defending Christian civilization. Bardaghi literally calls politics warfare by other means.
A real sense of existential threat among their supporters.
A fear of being eliminated if they don't fight back hard.
This brings us to the international dimension. These nationalist movements are connecting across borders.
They are. Despite historical differences, they find common ground. Anti-immigration, social conservatism, sometimes anti-EU sentiment.
And data analytics play a role in tracking this.
Yeah, companies track these online conversations, identifying coordinated campaigns, like that network attacking Maduro, then shifting to anti-Islam messages in Spain.
Or the false stories about the Notre Dame fire being amplified by Abascal and linked to the American alt-right.
Exactly. It shows coordination. Applebaum mentions a conference in Rome where all these different nationalist figures met.
United by a shared dislike of their own societies, a fear of losing something.
Pretty much. Even though, ironically, nationalist politicians were gaining power in some of their countries at the time.
Okay, let's bring it to the American context. Applebaum talks about moral equivalence.
Yes, the idea that democracy isn't inherently better than autocracy. Undermining faith in U.S. institutions. She mentions Jeane Kirkpatrick warning about this years ago.
And connects it to Trump's America First, downplaying alliances.
Right. A big shift from the more optimistic internationalist conservatism of the early post-Cold War years.
And we've seen the U.S. conservative movement fracture dramatically.
Hugely. Figures like David Frum, Bill Kristol becoming never-Trumpers, while others went all in. Applebaum mentions her own break with the Republicans.
And Laura Ingram's journey is quite something.
It really illustrates the shift. From a more traditional conservative, believing in American exceptionalism, to a staunch Trump supporter with a much darker, pessimistic view.
Despite contradictions, like her stance on immigration versus adopting immigrant children.
Yeah, and downplaying the pandemic.
Yeah.
Applebaum notes Ingram once emphasized virtue as essential for America, then later fully embraced Trump. It's a puzzling shift.
She even brings in historical parallels from France, Dreyfus, Vichy.
To show these debates aren't new, they're cyclical. Maury's siding with Vichy. History echoes.
So it all comes back to those fundamental questions.
How is a nation defined? Who decides? Who are we? And these questions are never really settled for good, are they?
And just when you think you're analyzing these long-term trends, bam, the pandemic hits.
Yeah, 2020. Applebaum describes her own son's chaotic journey home as borders slammed shut.
And the Polish government's border closure. Chaotic, maybe not effective, but popular.
Usually popular.
Yeah.
And it fits a historical pattern.
Yeah.
Pandemics often fuel fear, and fear often leads to an expansion of state power.
And figures like Farage, Ingram, Schmidt, they'd already laid the groundwork for more authoritarian responses.
Applebaum argues they had. They had already normalized certain ideas, certain rhetoric.
And Orban in Hungary really seized the moment, didn't he?
Absolutely. Using the pandemic as cover to give himself almost dictatorial powers, even arresting journalists who criticized the government's handling of the crisis. A stark example.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have the role of intellectuals, those clerks, the appeal of the one-party state, the power of medium-sized lies, and that restorative nostalgia.
The fragmentation of information, the rise of hyperpartisanship, and how crises like pandemics can be exploited.
And ultimately, understanding these forces, really thinking critically about the information you encounter is, well, it's vital for everyone.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe building on that pandemic point.
Yeah. Will this global crisis ultimately push us further down the authoritarian path that Applebaum describes? Or could it possibly spark some kind of renewal, a return to solidarity, a strengthening of democracy?
Something for you to definitely keep thinking about.